All right, welcome back, everybody, to another Future Focused, where we are navigating the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience with the stated goal of keeping you 10 steps ahead of things. And we'll see how good of a job we do this today. But I'm looking forward to this conversation because it will be a discussion about AI, but probably not the one you're expecting. So if the word olfactory science doesn't mean anything to you, it will by the end of this conversation, and hopefully get you thinking differently about this. So for those of you who are watching, listening, if you could go out, give this a review, share it with a friend, always helps the show. And be sure to subscribe to my Substack so that you can catch the Cliff Notes version in case you miss part of the discussion. But you won't, because you're going to want to listen to the whole thing. But just in case, please do that. So to navigate this conversation, I'm joined by Kordel France, and we're going to be talking about AI and really the power of smell, which some people might go, wait, say what? So Cordell, thank you so much for joining me. I've been looking forward to this one for a while.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to your listeners as well.
Yeah. Well, so let's get straight into it and jump into a little bit of background. I've gotten to know you through the process of getting you on the show, but others have not had that privilege. So AI and smell is, you don't start there. That's definitely not, I used to be a middle school teacher. That was not a class that usually showed up in middle school, things like that. So what was your journey? Like, how did you end up where you are today? Because you've got an interesting mix of engineering and technology and all this stuff, which is a unique blend.
Sure. So I originally got into robotics and AI when I was a toddler. So I grew up on a farm, and my father is a big proponent of using new technologies. And so he put a self-driving system on some of our tractors, and literally the things literally drove themselves. They're the size of like a small townhome, and they're driving themselves. And when you're
Yeah.
3 or 4 years old and you see this happening, it's like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right?
Oh yeah, I grew up in rural Minnesota and around farms, and that farm equipment is big and powerful. And the thought of it just driving around with nobody behind the wheel, like you said, it's kind of like, especially to a little kid, could be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. And so I asked my dad, I'm like, how do I work on this? How do I build these things in the future? And he goes, you got to go into robotics. You got to be good in math. You got to be good at this and this and this and
Yeah.
sensors and all these things. And that kind of paved my way into robotics and AI. And
Now, your
in the
dad
future.
built this. Did he have a background in this, or what? Did he just kind of figure it out?
No, he didn't. He bought the system and then he
Okay.
integrated it. So he's a tinkerer, and I mean, he doesn't have an engineering degree, but I would still call him an engineer because
Yeah.
he builds, this stuff that, I mean, I learned a lot from him. The stuff the guy
Yeah.
builds is insane. But yeah, he was a huge catalyst for me going into the AI and robotics space. And
Okay.
um if I really got concerned, or really consumed rather, by the contribution, my ability to contribute to the to artificial general intelligence, AGI.
Okay.
And I wanted to be a part of something that could contribute to senses that don't have a lot of study. So if you look at AI right
Yeah.
now, there's computer vision, which is artificial seeing, there's
Yep.
microphones, there's sound recognition, there's all these things, but there's not a lot of work being done on the sense of smell. And if you want to really have human level intelligence, which is one definition of AGI, you've got to concentrate
I
on
mean, we
building
have
out.
5 senses, so we can't just
Exactly.
only have a couple senses and call it good.
Exactly, exactly. And so I looked around at the field of the sense of smell. The study of smell is called the olfactory science. And there wasn't a lot of there are a lot of techniques and there are a lot of sensing methods out there, but there wasn't something that was synonymous in technology development, in my opinion, to what we have with cameras, microphones, speakers, etc. And so I wanted to help materialize that and build out the sense of smell for machines effectively.
I love that, and it is so funny that you say, like, you wanted to contribute in a way that was a little bit different than what else you were seeing. And I talk to tech leaders multiple times, sometimes a day. And when you say there's just not a whole lot in this, that's why I was so excited when your team reached out and said, "Hey, would you like to have Cordell on the show?" Because I have not had somebody who specializes in this arena, because there's just not a whole lot of focus on it. It's not where a lot of the commercial markets are focused. There's just not a lot of research into it. So it's awesome that you chose to take a different path instead of going, you know what I want to do? I want to create a new large language model.
Exactly. Yeah, I fully endorse all the efforts behind large language models and all
Yeah,
that's
it's
going
great.
on there. But there is a whole other field of AI, several other fields of AI outside of chatbots that have taken a bit of a back seat throughout the last few years, and it would be good to bring that forward again so that we can continue to materialize things beyond just large language model intelligence. So
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I think to your point, it's a much needed area as we consider to look forward. And also, as we get into some of the use cases and things like that, I think people are going to see, man, there's some real value to this too. It's not just like, oh, it's neat to tinker with. Like, no, there's tremendous innovation that can come from this. So I'm looking forward to it. So that's really what sets your trajectory. I mean, that's amazing. I don't honestly, out of the hundreds of guests I've talked to, it is very rare. And you may be one of the first that said, as a toddler, I was interested in this. And while it kind of evolved along the way, this really was the path that I was on from the beginning. Normally it's all over the map. So I actually think that's very unique and fascinating that that's the journey you've been on. So when you went off to school, did you know that the olfactory science was where you were going to specialize? Or was it really more, I'm going to get into the robotics, engineering side of things, AI, and then you started to specialize?
The latter. So
Okay.
I didn't even know what olfactory science was when I was in high school or
Well, you
even
certainly
beginning of
didn't as a
college.
toddler. I'm sure of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I didn't pronounce anything above two syllables, so yeah, I had no idea what was going on. And it's not something that's like talked about. Like, where's
No,
you don't take an olfactory studies course in college, right? That's not a thing. It's not
no.
very prolific. So you have to. But there's actually a lot of work done in the field. It's just not front stage.
Yep.
So it's something you kind of have to seek out, something you have to dive into, and it's actually really really fascinating once you dive more into it. Just because there's so many applications that I haven't even thought of, everyone else hasn't even thought of, that really deserve some attention that's symmetrical to what's being put into the other fields of artificial
Yeah.
intelligence.
No, I mean, I can see this being a much larger open field to explore than some of the other ones. Not because there's not endless opportunities elsewhere, but it's like, yeah, but this is almost untapped territory where you go, well, boy, I don't think a lot of people are even thinking about some of these things. So when you got into it, was there a specific problem set that you really wanted to solve for? Or was it, I kind of know I want to go this path because it's uncharted territory and I'll get there? Like, what did that look like?
I was really obsessed with trying to solve the problem of navigating by smell. So just like a
Okay.
dog can, just like a moth, an ant, right? There's these actually navigation by scent was the most primitive form of navigation for any biological being, right? Like the the most primitive forms of life, like moths, insects, etc., they navigate through scent. So
Okay.
there's evidence of success throughout nature.
Right, so it
And
wasn't like a hypothesis of could it, in theory, could we navigate by scent? It was like, well, we know that it's possible.
right. It's like you don't even have to wonder. It's like there's the proof. See a dog every day. I know that's the
Yeah, we
proof,
have
right?
tracking
Yeah.
bloodhounds that do this. Like it's real.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, why haven't we not replicated that to the same degree that we've replicated vision and hearing and everything? And so I wanted to try to solve that. And my original idea was to put these sensors. You have to build a sensing mechanism first, but once you get the sensing mechanism, put it on a drone and have it be able to basically navigate through scent, just like a dog can, except through in the air.
Okay.
And I worked a lot on that, but I originally kind of bypassed the sensor mechanism. I took what is available on the market and tried to make it fit the pattern that I wanted it to work in.
Okay.
And I found that wasn't the best way to go about it because there are a lot of sensing techniques for smell on the
Okay.
market, but they don't necessarily accommodate certain features that I wanted to see. So certain things I want to see is I want to see more sensitivity. So for example, a smoke detector can detect one compound,
Yep.
carbon monoxide, but it needs to be saturated very heavily. So it actually needs a lot of smoke to actually go off.
Okay.
If you think about
Unless you're in my kitchen. For some reason, my smoke detector, if I, burn an egg, it goes off. But I know I'm joking. I know exactly what you mean, where it's not something that is hypersensitive, I guess.
well, and you bring up another issue though. A lot of these sensors get saturated, right? Like your smoke
Yeah.
detector, once it sees smoke once, it's technically a little bit less sensitive than it is the next time, and the next time, and you got to replace it. So that's a problem with all olfaction sensors, is
Okay.
that decrease in signal as it's being used. Another issue is they're not rapid, right? Like if you think of a camera, we can take 240 frames per second, 800 frames per, there's like
Oh, some of those
exotic
high
cameras.
speed cameras. I mean, you're talking millions of frames per second if you really want to get into some of them.
Right. So you're thinking like millions of predictions per second from an AI model, and we're identifying that many times per second. But with smell, humans we don't have that frame rate with smell, right? Dogs have a much higher frame rate, but it's still
Yeah.
not millions of times per second. And so trying to replicate that into a sensing technique was another thing I wanted to work on, because the existing techniques took minutes or even hours to assess the compounds that are within
Okay.
the air. So that was another thing I want to solve. And then the final thing was being able to take an air, the environment, the air, and break it down into its constituent compounds. So instead of just smelling baked bread, right, can I break it down to say it's X% benzene, it's Y% pentane, it's Z%
Okay.
isoprene, right? Like, I don't think those are the compounds actually in bread, but you get what I'm saying, right? You can
It
break,
sounds good. Don't shh.
yeah,
People won't know. It
yeah.
sounds good.
If someone's going to listen to that and go, isoprene, that doesn't sound like a good thing to have in bread. Is that true? I'm going to
Where do
stop
you
eating
buy
bread.
your baked goods from, Cordell?
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, that explains what's wrong with this guy. But being able to break down the scent into its constituent compounds, like that's extremely helpful for a variety of use cases. And so that was another thing I wanted to solve, was build kind of a sensor that could detect multiple things simultaneously.
Okay.
And that kind of converged me to back away from the problem of solving scent by navigation and focusing on actually building out the sensor that
Okay.
works
Well, because
before.
I think of the complexity of some of this, and as you're talking about, and this is where I'd be really fascinated to as we get into the AI piece. But when I think about scent, there's a lot of complexity to that. Because going back to even the, substances and the chemical compounds that you're smelling, I mean, it's never a pure atmosphere either. You're dealing with, well, the air, yeah, there's hydrogen and oxygen and all these other things, but it's like, yeah, but then when the baked bread floats in, it's getting mixed in with all of these other things that you go, well, now how do we isolate that in a very particular way, which I can see where probably to the average person listening, and I can even see probably some very advanced minds going, that's a really freaking hard problem to solve. I just would rather go through something easier like identifying an apple with AI, where at least an apple for the most part always looks like an apple and it is a unique thing. You never like, well, is the apple there or is it not there? It's either there or it's not, type of a thing, where a scent can be very deceiving.
You're totally right. Environmental conditions play a huge impact, right? So you not only are looking at the compounds that are in the air, but sometimes they react a little bit, right? So they look different. So like benzene might look with one pattern, but then when you put it in the air next to 8 other compounds, now it looks slightly different, right? Even though it's
Right.
the same compound. And then you have environmental conditions like humidity, pressure,
Yeah,
heat.
I'm thinking
Those
like
all
atmospheric pressure, the humidity in the air, pollution. I mean, things like that you just go, well, okay, now how do we narrow all this down without just messing up the whole sensor?
exactly. So it is a very hard problem to solve, and that's where the AI component, the machine learning, comes in, because you're segregating signals, you're separating the wheat from the chaff, and we're trying to figure out, well, what's chaff, what's wheat, and how do we maximize those signals?
Okay.
And it is a very, very hard problem to solve.
Well, to me, but what you're describing, and to me, this is where I was excited to have you on, because I love when people look to take some of these advanced technologies to solve really hard problems that actually may have been impossible to solve absent the technology. Because I mean, I think about some of the things we're just describing. A normal human being would just go absolutely mad, even just trying to figure some of these things out, because of the complexity of it, where fortunately AI can look at all that stuff in ways and it doesn't get frustrated or bored or overwhelmed with things. And so if anything, it's actually the perfect opportunity to say, let's use this technology to focus on this thing that historically humans have gone, oh, forget it. That is too complicated of a problem for us to dive into.
Yes, I fully agree. It's there's so much that can be done, not only on the AI side, but the actual sensing side, and there's just so much untapped potential. And the applications, right? We're just talking about the sensing part right now and just kind of
Right.
the theory of it. There are so many applications that people don't even think about, right? I
Yeah, so
started.
let's dive into some of that too. I'd love to kind of go to this. We'll get into how it actually all works, but I'm actually curious because some people, I know my audience well enough to know that some people might start to figure out the transference of, oh, here's where that goes. But I can see a lot of people going, what would we really do with AI detecting scent? Like, how would that actually apply? And I've got some thoughts, but I'm curious, where did your wheels start spinning where you go, no, actually, this is a real problem that we can fix?
So AGI was one of them, right? Being able to just build
Yeah.
a sense of smell for AI, and then the second was navigation by scent, but the third was from a healthcare perspective or medical
Okay.
perspective. So when we exhale, that breath has literally thousands of compounds in it that give a indication, that give a legitimate pulse of what's going on in your body. They give a general health
Okay.
status, and being able to measure those can give you a lot of insight on what's going on inside. So we turned our sensors into a breathalyzer and allowed and built it to detect various compounds that you breathe into and can signify what's going on within your body. So the first things we looked at were pneumonia and influenza and COVID, and you literally just breathe into the device, and 30 seconds later you get a response, right? So these sensors are really smelling the breath, which actually used to be a legitimate form of medical assessment back in like the 1800s. Doctors would smell your breath, and then they realized,
Really?
yeah. So people obviously don't do that anymore for sanitary reasons, but they used to smell your
Yeah.
breath as
I
a
know,
way
like when
to
you
assess.
actually think about it, it's a little bit gross when you think about the fact every time you breathe out, there's thousands of chemical compounds coming out of your mouth. But all you got to do is watch one of those YouTube videos of somebody sneezing in like a UV light or something. And you're like,
Yeah,
oh, that's what, and that's a sneeze. But yeah, I mean, so that's interesting that back in the 1800s, that was, I mean, it would make sense. I mean, and I actually think back to my pediatrician. I think there were times that I even remember it again, not to the degree of specificity that we're talking about, but like even bad breath can be an indication that, hey, something's not right. There's something bacterial or something that's going on that is creating a bad smell coming out of your mouth because that's not normal.
exactly. Yeah, and there's not a really good way to measure that right now. Like if you think
No.
like an alcohol breathalyzer, right? That does measure that's a decent actually analogy to what, to being able to measure what's going on inside your body. Now do
Right.
that for all these other medical conditions. And so being able to build these breathalyzers that sniff your breath effectively and determine what's going on. It sounds
No, it
super
sounds
not
weird, and
sexy
that's where
that
I
way,
can
but
totally picture people. It just kind of bends your brain a little bit in a way where you go, "Wait, what did you just say?" You go, "Oh, you're sick." It's just not how we have historically thought about medicine. Normally, we would think, well, we go draw your blood, we do all these other things, we run a million tests. But when I think about scent and the speed at which you could potentially, is what kind of what we're getting into, like breathe into it, ding, like here's your results. That's incredible when you think about not only like the healthcare costs that are associated with some of these very inefficient, just time intensive, labor intensive ways of diagnosis.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to zoom in on that a little more, to exactly your point, we're going through clinical trials right now to assess the ability of the device to detect lung cancer. So right now, there's a series of ways you can detect lung cancer, but one of them, you actually have to go under the knife. You have to go into surgery, and they have to take out a piece of your lung, and
Yeah,
then
a
like,
biopsy.
yeah, the biopsy, exactly. So that's extremely invasive, costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time, life threatening. If we're successful, we'd be able to do that with just a simple breath sample, right? So that's something we're extremely excited about. And the device, there's a lot of other research out here to back this, but um, our intent is to not just look at lung cancer, but other cancers as well,
Okay.
because for example, pancreatic cancer, your body still exhales compounds that indicate what's
Okay.
going on.
There are unique markers to these different cancers.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, unique biomarkers. And the reason why we haven't really given this credence so far is because some of these biomarkers are so small. They're definitely there if you have cancer, and they're definitely not if you don't. but they're so subtle that they're easy to miss. And so you have to look at a part per trillion resolution or better. Just put this on a scale. A a smoke detector can look at part per thousand, or maybe very, very, very high part per million.
Okay.
Dogs can look at part per quadrillion particles per resolution. So that's extremely small, right? We have to look at a part per trillion. So we're not quite as good as dogs, but we're very more effective than we're highly more effective than other sensors on the market. So it's being able to detect that resolution that really makes this possible and compelling.
I'm going to rewind on some of this stuff, because there's a couple things that, as I'm thinking about this, where this is extremely innovative and encouraging with some of these things, as I'm thinking about this, not only from a medical standpoint, but also just from a human experience standpoint, because I've known many people who have gone through cancer or had cancer scares. And it's not only that, what you described of a biopsy being extremely invasive, there's also just the mental, emotional burden of, I have something, but I don't know what it is. And I have to wait for this procedure that has to happen that I'm already freaking out about. Then that procedure has to happen. Then I have to wait. I have to wait for the results. That is an extremely emotionally and mentally taxing thing that, to your point, in theory, well, it sounds like not even really in theory, in reality, if you could just breathe into it and go, we have your answer, like right now, you close that gap, which can be extremely traumatic for people. So I think about that, but then I also think about the folks who might listen to it and go, nah, there's no way. My kids, the thing that's awesome about having a bunch of little kids is they have you learn and explore all different sorts of things. But there are dogs out there that are trained on certain things today that they'll smell like low blood sugar. Like they can detect if somebody has low blood sugar because they can smell that so it's not science fiction. Like, to somebody who's like, I just don't really think that's possible. It's like, no, it's absolutely possible, because to your point, you're exhaling particulate that has a unique, distinct pattern that if you can detect it, you can say, well, you have this pattern, therefore it's this. You don't have this pattern, therefore it's not, which I think about how that can be even more accurate than a visual scan, where, okay, you go get a CT or an MRI and you think you see something and you're like, well, we think this is what it is, but we don't really know because we're just looking at it. And until we really get in there, we won't know. But I could see where it also challenged the healthcare model and flip it on its head, because it would be like,
Yep.
The whole healthcare model is built on, well, we got to get you in for an appointment. We got to scan you. We got to do all this. We got to run these tests. There's all this money associated with it. And you're going, why would we do that? Here, just breathe into this little tube. We'll tell you. It's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, when you go in for a CT scan or you go in to get the biopsy, like that's one data point, right?
Sure.
If we could put these in the homes of several people and you could do this twice a day, 5 times a day. I mean, do it when you brush your teeth. Most people brush their teeth twice a day, right? So around there. So external device when you brush your teeth, get a status of your general health. And instead of just taking the sample once, you can actually predict it earlier and you can paint a trajectory.
Yeah.
We did this with folks with pneumonia and influenza. We were able to track their trajectory. Some people were breathing into the device twice a day for months until they actually got influenza around the wintertime. And we predicted when they would get it. And so you ramp this trajectory. You start in like July, August, and they breathe every day. And then you can see the levels start to go up and you start to predict it, right? That's hugely powerful. If you can do that for
massive.
Yeah, if you can do that for all these different biomarkers, for all these different medical conditions, it really gives power to the people to be able to, more comfort, really. You release some of that emotional distress.
So one of my jobs has to do with working in value-based healthcare. And one of the biggest nuts to crack in value-based healthcare is, how do we predict when people are going to get sick before they get sick, or detect it very early? Because anybody who's been in healthcare for very long knows the earlier you catch it, or the more predictive you are, the easier it is to treat, the less it cost, it doesn't cost as much to treat, and the more likelihood you have of actually beating it, because it hasn't quite gone awry. So I think about like my Apple Watch and its ability to detect my heart rhythms and things like this. Like, I'm able to tell when I'm going to get sick days before it hits, because I can see my resting heart rate and all these other things. And that's exactly what you're talking about, but just through a completely different sense than we have historically used.
Yeah, it's another it's another biomarker that you can track just like you can with the other technologies that are out there, such as Fitbits and fitness trackers and all these things. And it enables really a whole new set of metrics and health statuses to be gathered that we weren't really ever thinking about before. So, I mean, there's still and you make a good point, right? Like the science is one thing, and I'll stand by the science every day and any day and any time because I've helped accumulate the data. But it's
Yeah.
also there's also a process that has to happen before this can ever enter the hands of people and be used in the manner I'm
Right.
suggesting. So that's going to be a pretty tough thing to go through. So yeah, I definitely have underestimated how hard that is, especially in the beginning. I was like, I'll build a product and they'll come, right? Of course, that's all I got to do. But it's different when you're in a highly regulated industry. There's a lot more work you've got to go through, even if your product is scientifically valid.
No, and I think that's something that many people who have not worked on the inside of healthcare, specifically in the innovation and research side of it, aren't always aware of. I mean, having spent time in pharmaceuticals and other healthcare industries, even just healthcare manufacturing, you may have the solution to a problem, and it may still be decades before you actually can take it to market, because one, it's high risk, it's highly regulated, and there's a lot of scrutiny over it. But again, like I was saying before, you're also pushing against an institution that has been established in a certain way that goes, well, wait a minute, this is how we make money. You want to disrupt the farm? Like, so there's no shortage of challenges that, yeah, I'm sure you've encountered along the way where you're like, hey, great, we fixed this, right? And it's like, oh, there's a lot that still has to happen.
Yeah, it's a huge underpinning. I mean, I feel like I still feel so naive about it because I learn more and more each day, and I've been doing this for years. But there's so much more that goes into it beyond the science and the data gathering. And the only thing that I mean, from a scientific perspective, I would have gone crazy by now if I wouldn't. I have a dog, right? And I take her
Yeah.
on a walk every day, and I see every day how she's tracking scents, and I see how it works. And there's a lot of research out there for dogs, as you were suggesting, detecting different medical conditions. Dogs smelling for COVID, dogs smelling for pneumonia, dogs smelling for explosives, dogs smelling for drugs, etc. So it can be done. It's like the proof is there. We have it in front of us. It's
Yeah.
just a matter
And
of
there's use cases for it. I mean, proven use cases, industries that go, we actually need this. We're doing it today, but the way we're doing it, I mean, I know how long it takes to train a dog on this. It's massive.
yeah.
Like, it is massive, and it's an animal. It doesn't live forever. It can't work 24/7. It's not, I mean, we can't speak to it. So it can become very difficult. There's a lot of barriers to this. So the inefficiency, the opportunity for this is massive.
Yeah, I fully agree. I fully agree. It's just a matter of trying to navigate some of those institutional hurdles and those regulatory hurdles, and we're going through the necessary precautions with clinical trials and building out, the regulatory quality management system and everything. But yeah, it's even though the science is ready and there's a lot of data supporting it, we've got a work cut out for us to actually get it to market. So
I'm curious for people who may, because we've talked about it a little bit, but for folks who may be more familiar with the AI space and how this works, like, I'm thinking through, like, how did you go about this for somebody who's trying to understand, how do you actually make a sensor be able to detect, and how do you use artificial intelligence to be able to pull that off? I mean, what does that process look like?
So it starts from like a physics level, starting looking at the exact sensors and what you're trying to detect. And what our sensors do is they look for they're basically looking for a lock and key relationship. So our
Okay.
sensors have an electrical current that go through them, and they're coated with a certain compound, and they're like a bunch of microscopic locks. And then
Okay.
when air comes over it, it's looking for keys, right? And if those keys fit the lock, then they send a signal back to the computer that's running the sensors and says, "Hey, I found this compound."
Okay.
And if enough lock and keys mesh, then that compound is basically extremely prevalent.
Okay.
And when you make the ability for those keys and locks to, or those locks to detect smaller and smaller and smaller keys, you get a much more fine-grained resolution of what you can detect. And
That
that's
makes
what,
sense.
yeah, that's what's enabled a lot of the success we've had so
I
far.
mean, that's like seeing something in 4K versus a flip phone camera back in the early 2000s. Like,
Beautiful analogy. Yes, absolutely. That's
okay.
exactly right. And so that's one problem, right? Is solving the sensing mechanism, but then it's a matter of trying to communicate, well, what's the data standard for smell, right? Images are in PNG files, JPEGs. That's how machine learning models learn. Sounds are in WAV files, MP4, MP3
What
files.
is sent in? There's not like
Exactly.
a .snt
Right?
file.
Exactly. So we've had to invent that. And the other thing about image, like since there's so much prior art and there's so much open source data online to build a machine learning model in image recognition or sound recognition, that's not necessarily a super hard problem anymore in
Okay.
many domains. There are no open source data sets for scent online. There
Well,
might be
that's what I was
some,
going to
but
ask, because like I think of like OCR has been around for a long time, that kind of image recognition component of things. And so, and there's a lot of these large language models, there's a lot of open source material, all this other stuff. But when I think about, there's not like a database you can go to for the sense of the world. And here's all the different, to your point, all the different lock and keys in some sort of uniform format that you go, okay, this is all consistent. This is exactly it. This is the database that we built that is now publicly available that people can do. So did you have to build that from scratch? Like, how did you go about that? Because that's massive.
yeah, we had to build that totally from
You
scratch.
really took
We
on
had
a
to invent
challenge.
it. Yeah, right. And you think about that from like an AI or a statistical perspective, you're at risk of drinking your own Kool-Aid, right? Like if you're
Oh yeah,
manufacturing your own data and also building the models, you can see how that can be a scary thing. So we
for
had to take
sure.
a ton of precautions, and we had to revise and retract a bunch of data in order to get to where we wanted to be. But we found that the best way for us to make sure we were on track is to find the gold standard in machine
Okay.
smell, which is called gas chromatography mass spectrometry machine. So
Okay.
GCMS for short. It's something the size of a fridge, weighs hundreds of
Yeah.
pounds,
I've
takes a
seen
lot of
them.
power.
Again, this is
Yeah,
the beauty of kids with YouTube. I've seen these things, and they're able to like point them at a thing and it can say, think like this is what it is.
exactly. So that's the gold standard for looking at
Okay.
chemicals within air. So we've trained our sensors and use that to ground them to make sure that if we see a compound, does the GCMS also see a compound of similar magnitude? If it doesn't, well, is that a limit of our sensors? Is that a limit of our machine learning model? Like, how do we adjust that? So we went through
So you're sitting
this
here matching these things up. I mean, essentially, this is how you're training the AI to say, this is what it's saying. This is what the gas spectrometer is saying. Here's what we're saying. And just, again, repeating the cycle with machine learning. Is that fair?
That's fair, yeah. So the first step was validation, right? Like there are
Okay.
some compounds that we can't detect with our sensors, but the GCMS can, and we had to
Okay.
find those limits. And then from there, we for the compounds we did know we could detect, we trained it with the GCMS. So the GCMS is
Okay.
the teacher, our sensors are the student, and that helped build out our data set and validate it to make sure we weren't drinking our own Kool-Aid, as it were.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah,
I mean, it sounds very familiar in some ways. The transferability of this sounds very familiar to some of the folks I knew over at Google when they first started trying to detect like cats in YouTube videos. It was basically like, well, this is the thing, this is the standard. And then they just were going back and forth training the AI to figure out whether the cat was there. But you're just doing this with different compounds and different technology to be able to pull the same thing off in some ways.
exactly. Yeah, it's a scientifically proven and sound method, and
Yeah.
it's been used everywhere else in AI. We just changed the tools we're using, but it's the
Right.
same principle.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So as you've been on, because where my head's going with this, I'm like, dude, that you really, when you said I want to chart new territory, you went big with it. What have been some of the challenges? I mean, you mentioned some of the challenges of just the healthcare space that, you just didn't necessarily anticipate. I think we've kind of unpacked some of just the complexity. There's not like a nice, neat open source data set that you can just go pull from. What are some of the other challenges that you've had to encounter and overcome through this process?
Everything is always harder with hardware, and
Okay.
the actually
Yeah, that's
getting the
fair.
right getting the right materials for the sensor, right? Like we have to be very pure with the material properties that we're using. It's not like we can just say, we can just send it out somewhere and have them be built and give them very vague direction. It's like we had to figure out exactly what materials to use, the exact quantity, and how pure they should be, and look at different electrodes, different conductors, etc. So making this a hardware problem, or solving the hardware problems, was one issue. The other thing
Okay.
too is you can't just feed these into a regular computer, right? There's
No.
no, you've got to. So we had to work with something called potentiostat, which is specific for. Basically, think of it like a computer for looking at chemicals, right? It's specific
Okay.
to chemistry, electrochemistry, and so that's something else that you've got
Yeah,
to
you can
learn,
just
right?
pull out your MacBook and be like, here, we'll just stick the USB-C drive in and we'll be good to go.
Exactly. I wish that was the case. We'd be so much further. But yeah, we had to go to a lot more granular level, and so the hardware problems were extremely difficult to solve because now if you think about it from like a systems level perspective, there were so many variables at play. It's like, okay, we didn't detect benzene to the right magnitude. Is that because it's a fault of our hardware? Like the sensor has bad material that isn't sensitive enough? Is it a fault with the model, the machine learning model? Is it a fault with the computer chip that we had designed? Like which one of these is at play here?
Yeah, I mean, you're having to diagnose when it doesn't work. You can't just say, oh, well, we'll just debug the code. It's like, well, yeah, but there's 10 different layers of stuff where it could break down.
Exactly. And that becomes being able to have a framework for how we triage problems and how we solve them. That took a long time to build. And it
Yeah.
sounds silly, but when you have all these variables at
No,
play,
you
that has
have
been
to.
extremely valuable. You have to,
You
yeah.
have to have that because if you don't, you won't ever dig yourself out of it. It's interesting. I'm continuing to try and find more people who are in the space of intersection of AI and robotics. But sometimes I get the questions of like, why are robotics taking so much longer to advance? And it's like, this is exactly what we're talking about. It's You can't just change the code and magically it works. It's like, well, no, there's environmental factors, there's hardware factors, there's quality control factors, all these things that have to be taken into account. And to your point, if you don't have a clear framework and process to be able to triage and diagnose this stuff, you'll never get anywhere.
Everything is 10 times harder with hardware. It always is. I have an engineer on our team, and he's built a lot of apps, right? He's built a lot of
Yeah.
stuff in websites, and he got exposure to hardware the other day. He's like, "Yeah, I'm just gonna push the code out, and I'm sure it'll work the first time." I'm like, this is your
Mm-mm.
first run. I can tell this is not gonna go the way you think it will." And he
Oh,
had
but the
he had a
code
baptism by
works. And
fire.
you're like, yeah, yeah, that's fine.
Exactly. I was like, there's so much more that goes on when you start interfacing with hardware, and that's what makes robotics hard, right? It's like AI is concentrated on building out the mind and the psychology, but when you start actually trying to put tangible, fingers, hardware, servos, shoulders, everything onto stuff, it becomes a very hard problem. And
Yeah.
the hardware limitations, I won't say the hardware limitations, but the hardware engineering is a very underestimated field for significance and both how hard it is.
Yeah. No, to me, it's one of I mean, again, it's goes up exponentially in terms of complexity. It's not just like, oh, we go from like 2 to 4. You're like, no, it goes like 2 to 8 to 16 to 32 very, very, very quickly because of how significant this gets. So, what are some of the things that you've had to do to overcome some of that stuff?
We have a very multidisciplined team, so it's not like we can go pick another hardware engineer or electrical engineer and just say, "Hey, we need you to
No.
solve this electrical problem." They've got to understand electrical engineering. They got to understand chemistry. They have to understand these low-level programming languages because you've got to understand how the code interfaces with the hardware and what could be going wrong with the chip we've built and the sensor. And since our sensors are chemistry based, you got to understand, like, why am I not getting a certain signal when these chemical reactions are occurring? Like, you have to have knowledge of this. So there's a heavy. It makes it more difficult for people to get ramped up very quickly in what we're doing.
Oh, it's a
But
multi-discipline for sure. It's not just like, oh, you specialize in Python, great. It's like, well, no, I mean, you got to know the whole gamut of things.
right, because you miss the other thing from like a data analysis perspective is you can be a very good data scientist, but a lot of the stuff we're looking at, a lot of the signals we see look like noise if you don't because we're looking at a part per trillion resolution. That's extremely small. That is noise to some degree, right? Until it's
I
not.
mean, it is. Statistically, it is noise,
Hmm.
especially to a human processing that.
Right. So it's not exactly intuitive from a data science perspective or programmer perspective, AI perspective, like what you're looking at until you really immerse yourself into the problems we're trying to solve and appreciate how each component plays into what's going on. Because I mean, even as a data scientist, I've got to know it's like, well, that problem that's a machine learning model problem, or that problem is I'm seeing this in the data because the electrode is it's now saturated, right? The sensor's now saturated.
Sure.
We need a new one. Being able to know that it's very hard to find these multidiscipline people that we can just hire and drop in and have them be productive. But so there's a lot of training that has to go on, a lot of on the job training. But it's a new field that I would say we are pioneering to some degree, and there's some pride to be taken with that, even though being able to train people takes a lot of time.
Well, yeah, for sure. And I'm actually curious because one of the things that is in discussions a lot that I I hear this said and I roll my eyes a bit when I hear it is there's a misunderstanding of AI where it's just like, well, just throw AI at it and that'll simplify things. And so I'm really curious, how is this evolving in terms of the role you and the team members are playing as compared to like, how is AI involved in that? Just because I think sometimes I hear the doomsday stuff of like, oh, there's not going to be anything for people to do. And then I talk to people like you with some of these really complex things where it's like, there is a world where we have to work together on some of these really complicated problems, but the roles change from what it would have been, 30, 40 years ago.
You're entirely right. Yeah, I mean, we've taken the way we're using AI to. I mean, I don't think I can necessarily throw all of everything I've talked about with you into ChatGPT and have it come out with a
Yeah.
model and plans for hardware design and everything, right? Like these are human. Maybe it'll get there one day. I don't know. I won't discount that, but we're a long ways off from that,
We're a
right?
long ways. Go ask it to make a Lego instruction for you. My kids and I did that just as a joke. Like, we've got a bin of Legos, make an instruction on how to make a house. And it's still very dumb in some ways. It's
Oh
brilliant
my
when used
gosh.
in the right way.
That's such a good Turing test, like for intelligence, is can your machine learning model build a Lego instruction from these Legos? That's brilliant. I like that. You should copyright that here. That's amazing. I like that. That's how you
That-
qualify intelligence for your AI is can it give you a Lego instruction from the Legos you've given it? That's amazing.
yeah. Yeah. And I can tell you right now, even the latest models are terrible at it.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's so funny. But I mean, we're leveraging. I mean, there's some problems of some specific sub problems that we can give AI to solve, right? Like we're trying to
Yep.
automate some of our work, some of the boilerplate code that we write, some of the boilerplate tasks we have to do. We're using large language models to try to optimize that. So we're trying to use it to augment our capabilities and have us move forward. But I mean, it's not replacing any one member of our team by any means. And I think that a lot of these, especially when you start associating hardware with problems, that's where humans become very, very crucial to solving the problem, because now it just takes a different level of intelligence to be able to take abstract software, integrate it with hardware, and then understand all the dynamic variables at play when you're trying to make them work together.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about that, especially, we talked about the complexity of hardware and what it adds to the equation. And I just even think back to, I mean, this was years ago, but, we were trying to do detection of like system problems, hardware problems in manufacturing plants using AI. And it was extremely difficult because, again, nothing in the real world, AI does not handle unique situations very well. It just really doesn't. And so when it was like, well, but according to the model, it should look this way. And you're like, yeah, but it doesn't work that way. So now what do I do? And it's extremely complicated in that. So I can see where there's a world where it's like, yeah, you're finding ways where AI can streamline and automate some of the things that are repeatable and predictable. And then there's these other really complex problems where you're like, yeah, I could go ask ChatGPT how to do this, and it would just give me a very verbose, loaded with adjectives response that makes absolute zero sense.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I draw the analogy to like the search engine, right? if you had a question, you had to cycle through a bunch of encyclopedias. You actually had to go to the library, 20, 30, not even 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. That was a process to find an answer to your question.
Right.
With the advent of the search engines, you're able to just go search it, right? But I would argue that we're all way more efficient, and we're in some capacities, not all, but in some capacities, we are more intelligent because of the amount of information at our fingertips with the advent of search engines. And I think AI is going to follow a similar trend. Granted, it is a lot more capable and powerful, but it's going to make us extremely productive and efficient and augment our capabilities before it starts to replace humans.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and I think even as you said, because we talked about this before I hit the record button, even you're seeing in your own work, it's not even that it's replacing things that you did. It is, but it's actually changing the role you play in terms of, like you said, backstage. Like, no longer am I just trying to become more efficient because I can't. It will be more efficient than me, but I'm learning how to orchestrate things in a different way, knowing that, okay, me trying to find efficiencies in these processes isn't actually the best use of my time anymore. It's going to crush me on that.
Yeah, you're totally right. I'm trying to be less efficient at playing the instrument because I know AI is going to play the instrument way better than I can, and I'm trying to look at how do I become the conductor and be really efficient at being the conductor that orchestrates all these AIs together to make me more productive and more efficient. And I think that's been a helpful framework for me to start thinking about how to be more optimistic about the AI human convergence, and just how I should stay ahead of the curve, to be honest.
Yeah, no. And I think, what's interesting about that is I love the analogy you just used there, because I think that's something everybody's struggling with right now. Because in the past, getting better and better and better at playing the instrument was the thing to do. You're like, well, yeah, I want to get really good I want to be the best of the best at playing the instrument. And now that's actually a terrible career strategy to go, well, I want to be the best of the best, but you still need to know how to play it well enough to know when the instrument's being played poorly, so that you can go, oh, whoa. Like we gotta, I'm listening. And again, the role of the conductor of going, hey, the winds sound terrible right now. We got to tune these things. Oh, and by the way, now I'm seeing all these other instruments that need to come together. And that's an exciting future. But I think in some ways that can be very overwhelming for people who are like, wait, but I just spent the last 20 years of my life getting really good at the clarinet. And you're like, well, we might not need you to play the clarinet anymore.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's the most sobering moment I've had was actually a couple months ago, and I built something. It took me 7 months to build, and I spent a lot of work working on it, and it worked really well. And then I gave that same task to a large language model, and in 37 seconds, it built the exact same thing, and I was crushed. I'm like, oh my, like, what do I do? Like this, I've spent years mastering this programming language, understanding these frameworks, like trying to assess the problem, and this AI model just solved it in literally thousands of times faster than I could. And I was like, to be honest, I was in a bit of a depression for a few hours.
Oh, yeah.
Like, what do I do? But now I'm of the mind, I'm like, all right, well, I know it's going to be better at me in a lot of things. How do I make sure that I'm the conductor and it's the instrument instead of the other way around?
Well, and I think, and then I've got some questions on kind of the application piece still that I want to dig into, but I really like that we've made this shift in it, because sometimes as we start thinking about these advanced models, and even just your talk about the contribution this can make to artificial and general intelligence, and now there's talk of artificial superintelligence, and where that's going. And so that can create a lot of fear and anxiety in people who go, oh my goodness. But really, when we start to think about these things, it's like, yeah, but it never quite goes the way you think. And I even think to the example of, like you said, you wrote this code or whatever it was, and in 38 seconds, it did it. So maybe in the future, you wouldn't have spent 6 months trying to figure out all the details of the code, but there still was value in knowing enough about it that when it created it in 38 seconds, you could go, that isn't quite what I was trying to go for. I actually need to tweak it this way because I need you to go in this direction and I need to modify this. And it's a much more, again, the analogy of the conductor is very much the case. And any good musician, I know we're really playing this musician thing out there, pun intended.
It works.
But the thing is every great conductor I've known knows how to play the instruments. They may not be a master at it, but they at least knew the basics of what to do. So they knew how to listen when it was right, how to give instructions when it wasn't doing what it wanted to. They had to have a level of mastery that was still superior to, an average person, but it was just a completely different way in which they applied their skill set. They'd never go take over the first trumpet because they'd be like, well, I'm not that good at it, but I can play the trumpet and can say, nah, the way you're hitting the notes this way is actually not the way we need it to, because when you do it like that, it actually sounds terrible in the broader orchestra. And then it's like, oh, okay. So the subject matter expertise, because I've seen things where people go, so do we just dump subject matter expertise? And I'm like, no, you're just going to apply it differently.
That's where, if you do that, that's where I get concerned about AI taking over, is because it's like, well, if we get relaxed and we start dumping subject matter expertise, then we don't have a way to check. AI is never, it's going to get good, but it's never going to always be perfect and bulletproof. And if we can't check that, and if we get lazy, that's when bad things will start to happen. We still need to have subject matter experts that can coerce things in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, and I love that call out for people who may go, so you're saying my subject matter expertise is a waste? No, it's actually not. You're just going to apply it in a wildly different way. And on a comical level, I dropped my weekly update recently and talked about this whole Reddit thing, where again, Google and some of these other models were like, hey, let's hook up our LLMs to Reddit. What could possibly go wrong? And you're like, did you not put in the data architecture and the triaging of what's a good response versus a bad response? And now it's telling people who ask, I'm depressed, what should I do? Jump off a bridge? Like, how did you not think that? And again, getting lazy and complacent and going, oh, we'll just let the AI do it, I think is actually one of the most dangerous things that we could ever do as this technology booms.
I fully agree. And there's so much subtleties in what we do as humans, right? Like that there's sarcasm, there's emotions. I mean, in Reddit, right? You can get 8 different meanings from the same Reddit response because people just interpret the comments in different ways. It's not punctual, right? Like AI it's going to interpret it probably one way based on all the training data. And now the training data for all the AIs is basically Wikipedia and the entire internet. So they all have the same training sets now. So they're all going to interpret things in the same way largely. And yeah, so humans still have a huge proponent of making sure the future is positive, to be honest.
Okay. Well, I hope that encourages people. And that's where I thought it was a little bit of a deviation from what we were talking about. But I think given the complexity of this, it just highlights how exciting of a future there is if we play it right. Because to your point, we could get lazy and complacent, and that's a choice we could make. And like you, I'm like, that will end in destruction. It will not be a happy ending if we go down that path. And anybody who's watched a sci-fi movie should know this, and yet we continue repeating it. My last kind of, as we come into the home stretch on this, you shared some of the use cases and some of the ways that you're doing it. What are some of the ones that you're most excited about that you're going, hey, like we're making really notable progress in these areas for people who might go like, where might we start to see this stuff coming to the surface?
So there are 2 particular things that I'm really excited about. One is we've been building out this library of compounds, and it's not like one compound is specific to healthcare or specific to navigation by scent or whatever. Some compounds have multiple use cases. And so we're trying to build out this giant library of compounds that we can detect, and we can detect well, that we can use across a variety of industries. And we hope to be able to make that data available to other folks in the future.
Okay.
We have to grow as a company since we're a startup, so it'll probably be licensed out. But eventually, I hope that scent data or olfactory data is as prolific and as much of a studied science as the rest of the other AI and data science disciplines. So being able to build out this data set and make sure and contribute to olfactory science and just build out a sensor that can detect scent at the same resolution and competitiveness that other data mediums are out there that can, then that's one thing I'm excited about. The second thing is space. So right now the GCMS, they send these up on the space station to analyze various compounds that samples come back from lunar rocks, and there's rovers that send other extraterrestrial samples back, and they're analyzed by the GCMS, right? Every kilogram that goes up on a rocket costs millions of dollars. And these machines, the GCMS machines, are extremely heavy. They're extremely power hungry. So they cost a lot of money, they take up a lot of space, and our device fits in the palm of your hand. It's the size of a bar of soap, and it doesn't take a lot of power,
That
and
is insane.
it has the potential to, I won't say replace the GCMS, but in these types of scenarios, it can
No, but
definitely fill
I
in.
mean, it'll still play a role, but to be able to democratize that kind of technology on a level is significant. Because
Yes,
that's not something
absolutely.
just anybody can have. And like you said, you can't just ship it around because it's not just an easy thing to use.
Exactly. And so being able to put these on like rovers to be able to detect signs of life at other planets, and having that space-based exploratory nature about it, that's one thing I'm really excited about. So we're trying to look at the compounds that are heavily used in the aerospace industry so that we can be prepared for those types of applications in the future. Space-based applications are extremely intensive from the engineering requirements, so we have to really
Okay.
focus on satisfying those. But the underlying sensing technology, I think we'll be ready for very quickly.
You know what is really encouraging, and just kudos to you and your team on this, is, the show is called Future Focused, and I love getting the opportunity to connect to people who are they're thinking bigger than just what's in front of their nose. So, where some people in your space might only be thinking of the very practical applications of, well, here's the 10, cancer forms that we'll be able to detect, which is great. It's super great innovation. But to hear you say the things you're most excited about are actually the level above that, where you go, how do we actually create the databases to actually democratize this so we can drive greater innovation? So we don't have to be the bottleneck to this and go, well, everything has to channel through us. Let's get something out there so that it isn't this niche space that many people don't have access to. And, the application of, how do we get this into, again, the democratization of the technology? Those kind of innovations are the ones that drive exponential innovation, because then you're passing the baton to other people who go, maybe I just want to fix the cancer thing. And so I'm just going to go super deep in that area, but I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have this data set, if I didn't have this technology. And you really are paving a very unique path. And I think it's awesome that, coming from a toddler, watching your dad mess around with agriculture equipment, to going, how do we actually use technology to change? How do we set up something that's never been created before? Is awesome.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm very excited and very passionate about olfactory science, and our sensors and what they can do. And I hope this inspires some other folks to look into the field a
Yeah.
little more and contribute to AI in that fashion. So thank you for
Okay.
having me. I really appreciate
No,
it.
well, one last question for you. And I'm curious, this is just more a prediction than anything. Because if anything, I've learned predictions anymore don't mean anything, because you throw a flag out there and you're like, well, yeah, it didn't win. What kind of timelines are you and your company looking at making some of these things, in terms of being able to achieve some of the things you described? Are we talking months, years, decades? Where do you see it based on your best assessments?
So I have to answer that in a long way. Our
Okay,
investors
fine.
are extremely focused on the healthcare sector, so they
Okay.
want to materialize that very quickly. It's not going to be quickly, but because of the reasons I
As
suggested.
quickly as healthcare moves.
Exactly. So from a scientific perspective, I can claim everything that I said that we can do with healthcare, but we have to go through the regulatory route in
Yep.
order to actually make that available. So from a product perspective and a regulatory perspective, we are subject to their pace, and
Okay.
that will take a few years, to be honest.
Yeah.
I still don't know how to assess how long that will take because I'm learning more every day, but I don't think it will be within 2 years. I think it'll be more than that. The other applications, such as navigation by sense, there are certain compounds we can do that with today, and I could give demos
Okay.
and go through all of that. The space-based applications, like I said, we have to focus on building out the actual engineering and environmental requirements around a product that you can ship up into space. But the underlying sensing technology we can do today.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a solved problem. So just to requantify, healthcare is going to take at least 2 to 3 years. Uh, Navigation by scent, we could do that today. That's not a
Okay.
problem. We are doing that today. And the aerospace and space-based applications, I think, will take potentially another 12 to 18 months before we
Okay.
have something
Well,
competitive.
then what I will end with is, you've made some serious progress, because to be at that point where really a large majority of what's ahead is just navigating the typical red tape and bureaucracy that goes into, and some of it's good stuff. I mean, I've been in the healthcare space. I don't want anybody just handing you something. You don't want false cancer diagnoses. And I get it, type of a thing. But yeah, the fact you've made that kind of progress is a testament to the work you've done and how far you've come with it. And I think it's awesome. And if I can give you any encouragement on the healthcare front, having played in the regulatory space for a while, it gets exponentially faster. So I think that's the good thing, is once you start hitting some of the milestones, other milestones start opening up much quicker. As an example, once you can get FDA approval on something, the global marketplace opens up extremely fast and things like that. So that's an encouragement. And I'm very excited. And a lot of the people I know in healthcare are very optimistic about the future of healthcare with where technology is going. So Kordel, this has been fantastic. I have absolutely loved this. We will stay in touch, and I look forward to having you back to talk more about things as it continues to progress. So thanks for joining me, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This has been a fun conversation. I love your show, and thank you to your listeners. I really appreciate it. I hope to be back in the future.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Hopefully this challenged your thinking, made you realize, where things are at, and hopefully gave you a more optimistic lens on where things go, while at the same time recognizing we have a role to play and the choice is largely ours in where we go with this. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day and a great rest of your week. We will see you on the other side.